But hey, how many of you have used Chat GPT before? Who knows what I'm talking about? If you don't, I'm about to blow your mind. So it's like an AI language model. You can ask it to do things. There's a bunch of things. There's a bunch of things on like Twitter and the internet going around of like high school students trying to get it to write like full assignments for it, and it's pretty obvious. So don't actually use it. But I was using it to ask. I was like, "What is?" So I had this interaction with it this week because I was tonight we're gonna be kind of talking about how when people often like religious people specifically in the Bible ask Jesus questions, they're often just kind of dumb questions. And so I said, "What's the top 10 most dumb questions that you could ask?" So that's what I asked ChatGPT. So let's see the interaction. So I said, the saying goes, "There is no dumb questions." This is false. There's lots of dumb questions. Write me a list of the top dumbest questions you could ask. And this is what it said to me. It said, "I'm sorry." It basically apologized and said, "Hey, I can't do this. It goes against my programming to judge or belittle individuals," which I was like, I had no intent. So I told it, so let's go to what I told it. I said, "Oh, I didn't know this would belittle individuals, but can you give me a list of top 10 questions I should stay away from that people might think are dumb?" Right? Still get the same point across. So this is what it said. It came up with 6 of them. It says, "Certainly, here's some examples that you might want to avoid and ask in certain situations as they come across insensitive." As I look through these lists, I'm pretty sure my grandma has said every single one to me in the course of one conversation. And this is usually how it goes. It starts with, instead of "Did you lose weight?" it's usually "Did you gain weight?" And I say, "Grandma, leave me alone." And then she says, is your wife pregnant?" And I'm like, "Nope." And she's like, "Well, how old are you?" I'm like, "Well, I'm 27." Well, this whole conversation, this seriously did happen when I was like 24, because I do have kids now. But she's like, "Why don't you have kids?" I'm like, "I don't know, Grandma, I'm 24." And she's like, "Well, how much money do you make?" And I'm like, that's not a good reason just to start having kids, Grandma. I know it was for you back when you like rode cows to school, but now for me it's not. And then of course, because she's just old and she doesn't know how to use technology, I'm sure at one point she asked me if she could borrow a password. And I'm like, "Grandma, that's not even how the internet works. You don't just borrow stuff." But there's a lot of questions that just like you probably just shouldn't ask, right? Like asking someone, "Are you pregnant?" It's just probably never. Just wait till they tell you, and if they don't tell you, just act like you didn't know they even had kids. So there's a lot of times, but when we talk about the Bible and when I hear people talk about the Bible, I feel like I've had a lot of friends that either grew up in church or didn't grow up in church, and I've been having some different conversations with them, and they know that I'm like a pastor, which is to them, some of them is kind of weird. And so sometimes when they start talking about the Bible, it kind of sounds a little bit like this. They're like, "Well, yeah, in the Old Testament, there's a lot of rules and things that we're supposed to be doing. There's like wars, and God says a lot of things that sometimes make us feel uncomfortable, so we just kind of ignore that, because in the New Testament, that's when Jesus shows up, and that's really the whole deal, right? That's the whole point of this thing, is that we know Jesus, and so we usually just talk about him, and Jesus is pretty cool." Right, so I feel like that's like the most of the conversation that I have with people. And the thing that's really sad about that is the Old Testament is full of a ton of rich history, and I think we often miss the point of all of the laws and the rules of what God talks about. And so, but there's one major theme that kind of flows through all of this, and that theme is this: is what God says is best for me really what's best for me? And this kind of gets explored a couple different ways from the Bible. It starts on page 2 of the Bible when the serpent shows up to Eve, and the first thing it says is, "Did God really say that you can't do this? And did God really say that you couldn't do this?" Which is not at all what God originally said, right? And that story kind of shows it's the very first time that we ever see something where it says, "Is what God really says what's best for me really what's best?" And so the Old Testament does have some rules and things that we should follow, but it's not because God needs us to follow them. It's because this is how we set up communities and friendships and relationships in ways that are honoring to each other and also help us to experience what it was like back in the garden with God, right? That's like the story of the Bible. And so tonight we're going to look at one of those rules. It's in the 10 Commandments. It's called like remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And that is can be kind of a weird word. But the Sabbath was this time where you're not supposed to do anything. You're not supposed to work, and we'll kind of get into that. But we're going to go right to where it started, and it started in Exodus 20. And so we have that verse up here. We're gonna read it. It says, "Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath day of rest, dedicated to the Lord your God. And on that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you or your sons and your daughters, your male and your female servants, your livestock, any foreigners living among you." So no one should be out here doing any work. This is why Chick-fil-A's closed on Sunday, right here, because they're like, we're keeping it holy, so we got to keep the chicken. I don't know what they do with the chicken when they're not on Sundays, but maybe they just order it and they get it on. But anyway, this is why they do that. And a lot of people In our Christian faith, if you look at the average Christian in America, we kind of just take this and we're like, yeah, we just maybe that's why we have a weekend, right? And the weekend is kind of we can do whatever and it's fine. And I don't know how I feel about that. We'll kind of like get into some things, but the goal of tonight when we talk about like the Sabbath is not like, okay, here's the things you have to do, because we're going to find that's what people have been doing for thousands of years, is telling people exactly what you can and can't do, and that is missing the point of what the Sabbath is. And so I knew that, like I took some classes in college. I kind of talked about this idea, and I was like trying to remember them, so I literally just Googled it. I was like, I'm pretty sure there's like 39 categories of what people define as work, right? When it says like you cannot work, so 6 days are for work and one's for rest. People are like, well, what is work actually, right? We start to like ask those cynical questions of like, yeah, but what does that really mean? So here's a screenshot from a website, and this has been around for a long time. Can we go to the first one real quick? So this is the 39 categories of Sabbath work prohibited by law. So there's 39 categories. And you can see this was written on July 17, 2006. It's been around for a long, long time. But people still, there's like still some pockets of the Christian faith that like are really about this, right? And so you can go to the next one. This is I just did a screenshot of the top 25. But the very first thing is carrying. You're not supposed to carry anything. So, like, I shouldn't be carrying groceries. So if your mom wants you to bring in groceries on a Saturday, you just say, sorry, Mom, I'm Sabbathing. You're going to have to do it yourself. Well, actually, she shouldn't be doing it either. So, but it says burning, extinguishing, finishing, writing, erasing, cooking, washing, sewing, tearing, knotting, untying, shaping, plowing, planting, reaping, sowing. You can't sow. My grandma would have been so sad. Harvesting, threshing, winnowing, selecting, sifting, grinding, kneading, combing, spinning. You can't do any of these things. What? Kneading? Kneading like kneading dough, not like, oh, I need that. Oh, you thought eating. Well, actually, there's I think if I continued it, there's like it gets into kind of some cooking things. So actually, there is like a lot of people in the Jewish faith, a lot of them just fast because they're like, just to play it safe, we're just not gonna do anything, right? So this is a lot, right? This feels exhausting, and looking like this, you're like, man, how many you wish you didn't do any of these things? Just in general. They're like, I don't want to do any of these things ever. You know what I mean? But this is a lot of rules. And it all started with the rule was, hey, on 6 days you work, 1 day you rest. 6 days you work, 1 day you rest. And over time, people kept arguing, what does it mean to work? And we came up with 39 categories of what you're supposedly not able to do, which is pretty brutal. But when Jesus was on earth, people had a hard time with him, especially religious people, right? Because this has been around for a long time. This is probably the most thought out category thing, but it's been like this for a long, long time. And so when Jesus came, we're going to see an interaction tonight where he actually told someone to do the very first thing, which is carry something. And believe it or not, religious people got mad. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. So, but before we get there, in Matthew 5:17, this is kind of like the beginning of this story. Jesus says this. He says, don't, and he's talking to people, talking to some of the Pharisees, some of the religious people that are giving him a hard time, that had power. And he says, don't misunderstand why I've come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. So like these commandments that we're talking about, right? He's like, I didn't come to just get rid of all of them. I came to accomplish their purpose. Like, I didn't come to just say, hey, none of this matters. I came to say, hey, this is the why. This is what it looks like when you follow this, and this is how life-giving it is. And so the thing that was intended to originally be a gift, which is rest, kind of became a prison as we kind of tried to figure out what are we not allowed to do and what can we do. And I think outside of finding rest, which is what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the evening, when you boil things down in the Christian faith to can I do it or can I not do it, and we don't talk about the why, we miss the things that are intended to be gifts and we allow them to be prisons in our lives. Which is why oftentimes if you talk to people who maybe grew up in a Christian home or kind of was a follower of Jesus and not anymore, a lot of the times their verbiage and how they talk about things and the framework is only surrounded around, well, it was because I couldn't do this. And that truly is kind of missing the point. So we're going to get into this story. This is John 5, chapter 1. So it says, afterward, Jesus returned to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish holy days. Inside the city, near the sheep gate, was a pool of Bethsaida with 5 covered porches. Crowds of sick people, blind, lame, or paralyzed, lay on the porches, and one of the men lying there had been sick for 38 years. When Jesus saw him, he knew he had been ill for a long time, and he asked him, would you like to get well? Let's go to the next one. I can't, sir, the sick man said, for I have no one to put me into the pool when the water bubbles up. Someone always gets there ahead of me. And Jesus told him, stand up, pick up your mat, and walk. Instantly the man was healed, and he rolled up his sleeping mat and began walking. So I'm going to pause there for a minute. So there was like this pool kind of like going, and people believe that this pool had the ability to heal people and kind of like if they had things, so people would gather. But the thought was like, well, it's really only the first person that gets in would be healed. And so this guy, obviously, who couldn't walk, it was pretty difficult. So he's sitting there for a long time. And so Jesus heals him. So this is like an insane miracle, right? This is incredible. If you were to see someone that hadn't been able to walk for 38 years of their life, and Jesus just says, stand up, pick up your mat, and walk, that would be incredible in just that. But I think in our culture, right, that wouldn't be a big deal for someone to pick something up. So it says, but this miracle happened on the Sabbath. So the writer, when John was like writing this story, he's like, Jesus healed them, which is incredible. But Jesus kind of made kind of a big no-no, right? He healed this man on the Sabbath. So it says the Jewish leaders objected. They said to the man who was cured, you can't work on the Sabbath. The law doesn't allow you to carry that sleeping mat. But he replied, the man who healed me told me to pick up your mat and walk. So he's like, I don't know who did it, but some dude that healed me, he's the one that just told me to do it. So I did it. Like, I'm healed. I'm not going to argue with that guy. He's going to unheal me, right? I'm just kidding. That probably wouldn't happen, but I would think that would. He says, you can't work on the Sabbath. The law doesn't allow you to carry that sleeping mat. But he replied, the man that healed me told me, pick up your mat and walk. Who said such a thing as that? They demanded. The man didn't know, for Jesus had disappeared into the crowd. I think there's two more verses. Yeah. But afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and told him, now you're well. Stop sinning, or something even worse may happen. Then the man went and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this is kind of the start of these Jewish leaders that got really frustrated with Jesus and were trying to find a way. Because Jesus is like, that was rule number one of what we're not supposed to do on the day we're supposed to be resting, is carrying something. And you see how they kind of took this thing that was a gift. So Jesus gave this guy a massive gift, the gift of healing, the thing that was kind of plaguing him his whole life. And he's now released from that. And people were upset because, well, they were operating inside the prison of what does it actually say? And how do we define that? And so Sabbath, and this isn't the only time that Jesus was accused of these types of things, but people have the tendency to take the gifts that Jesus has for us and turn them into prisons. And so we're going to go fast forward just a little bit. So Jesus, after he kind of gets in this argument with the Pharisees, and I kind of skipped some of that, and you can read this in John chapter 5, but a little towards the end of the chapter, he says, you search the scriptures because you think they give you eternal life. But scriptures point to me, yet you refuse to come to me to receive this life. So this is what Jesus is kind of hinting at. And Jesus often talked in parables and things that made people think. And so when they walked away and they're having conversations with people and they wake up the next morning and they're thinking, how many of you have like had a conversation with someone and you're like, man, I should have said that. That would have roasted them. Oh, I would have got them. And you're like, think about it right when you get home and you're like, oh, if I just remembered that, that would have been the best comeback of all time. Right? That's like, I feel like that's how Jesus talked. It was like intentional. It's going to like hit people in the heart. And then they're going to go away and they're going to like be wrestling with it. And they're like, is that what he was talking about? And then it's like, oh, and it kind of comes back later. And so he says, you search the scriptures because you think they give you life. By breaking down the laws and the rules and understanding them and memorizing all the rules, you think that that's where life's found? And Jesus said, that's not where life's found at all. The scriptures point to me, and that's where you find eternal life. You refuse to come to me to receive this. But Jesus there's 3 times in the Bible where it says he did something on the Sabbath, and people and Jewish leaders from different places all got mad at him. So we're going to look at Mark chapter 2, Mark 2, verse 27. And this is one where all the disciples are kind of walking through this town, and they grab some grain, and they kind of eat it along the way. And they're like, whoa, you're not supposed to be harvesting on the Sabbath. And if any of us, right, we grow up in the Midwest, we know what combines are, right? We've seen people harvesting corn and things like that. Walking through and grabbing something, that's not harvesting. Like, we get that. That's like, we're good Midwest people. We know what that is. But they're like, whoa, you did pick something, so technically that is harvesting. And Jesus kind of says that, he says, in arguing about the Sabbath, they're telling him whether he should or shouldn't do it. And this is how he responds. He says, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. Jesus is essentially saying the Sabbath is a gift to you. You don't have to follow it because God needs you to do something. This is something that's meant to be a gift for us. Rest is a gift for us. And in American culture, we're often not very good at resting. right? We do a lot of the things. I'm sure a lot of you guys are involved in tons of things, and they're awesome. I feel like I'm just like busy all the time. And we're not supposed to be that way. Because when we're busy, if you go back and think about that original command in Exodus, right? The first word is remember. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. 6 days you're to work, 1 you're to rest. We need to remember to rest, because if we don't, we'll just fill our lives with a bunch of things. We'll scroll on our phones for a long time. We'll watch a ton of awesome shows on Netflix, but we won't actually find rest. And so now that we talked a little bit about I hope you guys see the need for Jesus was pretty adamant about finding rest, and it's not about not doing all of these things. So for the last 3 minutes before we go to small group, we're going to talk about, well, what are some of these things and what is the purpose of Sabbath? And the point of Sabbath, as Jesus is kind of talking about, it's to cease what we're doing, and it's to be able to rest and be able to enjoy this gift. And so in Matthew 11, verse 28, it says this. It says, Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden that I give you is light." Man, I think that's such a good verse. I think it also is one that really shows Jesus's kind of personality and kind of his posturing to people. And so a couple things that I think is really interesting about this. He says, "Let me teach you, because I'm humble and gentle at heart. You will find rest for your souls." I feel like the phrase "rest for your souls" is like, man, I could use some rest for my soul. This is like talking to the deepest part about who we are as human beings, and we need to find rest. With all the things that happen in your life, the ups and downs, whether it's finding out that family members are getting divorced, or that people are having sicknesses and cancers and death in the family, and we fill our schedules with all these things, and sometimes it's like we don't give ourselves moments to even be alone with ourselves, let alone be alone with God. And this is the rest that Jesus is saying, I want to give you rest for your soul. I want to give you healing. And Jesus says, you need to come to me. That's why when the Pharisees were arguing with him, Jesus says, you try to search the scriptures to find where you can do it, but the only way you can find that is in me and with me. And so I've only started really taking a formal Sabbath, like a day of rest, right? That's what we're talking about, a day of rest. And I've started doing that intentionally on Fridays. So I don't work on Fridays, so that's when I have a day of rest. And what I do is I try to do as little technology as possible. So, and what I'm about to say is this is a checklist for how to have the perfect Sabbath, but what the point of the Sabbath is to find intentional time with God. That's what Jesus is talking about when we look at these passages. It's finding intentional time with God. And so however you can do that, that's the purpose of Sabbath. It's to find rest in him, and probably more so than just I read my Bible for 5 minutes this morning, or I prayed. It's probably a longer duration. So who's been a camp or CIY before? Any type of camp, right? Right, when we come back for those types of camps, we often feel really good in our spirit and our heart. We're like, yeah, I'm on fire. I'm going to come back and read my Bible every day. And it just feels like this big energizing moment. A ton of people, for the first time, sit down and take time to think about what does God have for me? And as we think about those things, there's people that make decisions to follow Jesus, and it's awesome. And then you come back to kind of your normal life, and you get back into the flow of things, and you're like, and it's gone. And I really think that camps like CIY or kind of Youth for Christ camps, or any camps that you've ever been to, they're great, but truly it's probably the first time you've experienced a place of rest as what Jesus is talking about. You've spent a large amount of time trying to talk. You've been talking about God in small groups. You've been listening to people talk about God. You're sharing things with other people. You're in small groups. You're talking about. That's what it's like, and that's the rest that Jesus is talking about. This is the renewal that he wants to give you, and he says, hey, you need to be doing this weekly, because it's hard to make it through your whole life if you're not finding rest. And so when I Sabbath on Fridays, I usually go for a run in the mornings. I don't listen to any music, because I love music and my brain can go. And when I run, I just try to think of things I'm thankful for. And so I usually drive out to a park to run, and then when I drive back, I don't listen to music ever. I might listen to maybe a sermon or a podcast I like listening to the Bible Project podcast, things that just kind of talk about different themes of the Bible and topics. I get home, Naomi and I will spend some time reading our Bible together. We'll pray together. When I put Eleanor, our little daughter, down for a nap, we have the little storybook Bible, right? So I read her a chapter of that, and I pray with her. And then later in the evening, Naomi and I might be reading my Bible by myself or listening to another podcast. And for some of you, you're like, that sounds miserable, right? And I think the first 2 times I practiced this, it was like, it kind of felt hard. It was like, okay, I get it. I'm like super Jesus mode today. Like it feels good, right? But I think at the end of the day, there was like still something in my heart that still felt a little off. And believe it or not, guys, I have conflicts with people, right? And I was thinking, I was like, man, I just feel like I should pray for them. Like I should pray for, I've been frustrated about a couple different things, and it's like some family stuff. And so I was like, I should probably pray for some of those family members. And so I prayed that God would give me peace. And I just asked like God, I was like, God, I know you said that you'll give me rest. And so I pray for peace in these situations. I feel like I don't really know what's going on. And at the end of the day, I was like mad when I woke up this morning, and I just feel light. And so now Fridays have become this thing that I really look forward to doing. And it's not that you can't do anything, and you don't have to do any of those things. I guess I want to be very wary of telling you, like, this is exactly what you should do. Because as we looked at the list, that was like the whole list of things of what you shouldn't do, right? And there's lots of things you can do, but the point of the Sabbath is finding times to rest in who God is, have conversations about him, maybe text a friend and tell them like, hey, I want to pray for you right now. How can I do that? I want to have conversations about God. What's God been teaching you? Maybe what's something you've been struggling with that you're like, hey, the Bible talks about this, and I don't know if I get it. Let's talk about it. There's no wrong answer. The only right answer is doing something that draws you closer to Jesus on the Sabbath. And so I hope this was like a good intro. You're going to go into your small groups. I'll pray in a minute, but we're going to go into some small groups, and we'll kind of talk about some of these things and how to find rest. But guys, here on Wednesdays, we hope that this is a place of rest for you as well. We hope it's a place that you can come, be encouraged, see people that you know. You can also be challenged a little bit, but also just someone to say like, hey, it's good to see you. Like, we like having you here. And so that's what this is supposed to be. That's what following Jesus is supposed to be. Don't overcomplicate following Jesus. Find times for rest, find times to be in relationship with Jesus, and find times to care for other well, because that's all that Jesus did. So let's pray. God, you're good. God, we're grateful for the ways that you show us how to have rest, and I'm sorry that we're not very good at it. I'm sorry that our hearts long to just play video games and watch Netflix and talk with friends and text people, and these are all things that I know I can fall into the traps of. But God, you've created rest as a gift, and I pray that you would just challenge us and maybe create an uneasiness in our own hearts and spirits, that you would help have us to pursue what that looks like. God, when Jesus was on this earth and he talked a lot to people, he talked in parables in ways that were confusing to them and left people wondering, well, what does that mean for me? And God, I pray that you would challenge each student and leader in this room for like, yeah, we kind of talked about rest, but what does that mean for me? And I hope that you would put it on their heart for what you would have for them to do. I pray that you would give them opportunities to find rest and space in their life, and that we would see the fruit that comes when you give us rest. God, you're good all the time. Amen.